This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Thanks again for joining us today. Today we are going to wrap up our series on Blade Runner and Blade Runner 2049. In the past 3 episodes, we've discussed these 2 movies and the really powerful themes they uncovered and discussed. Today, we're going to discuss how the 2 movies fit together and explore a few more issues that came up and just try and tie these 2 movies together. I'm very happy to be joined again by Erik of the Reconsider Podcast. And as we well know, since you've listened to the 3 previous episodes, we know that Reconsider is a political and current events podcast. Erik and his partner Xander help you contextualize current politics and history and broader forces and political theory. Reconsider helps you rise above the one-liners, the 140-character politics, and the tribal narrative. And their motto is, we don't do the thinking for you. Thank you so much for coming on for a 4th time, Erik.
Oh, yeah, my pleasure. I mean, obviously, I love your show. And one of the things I really love about talking about movies like this is it lets us look at, and by like this, I mean really good movies that do a great job exploring society, exploring humanity. They let us as people really look into humanity and look into society today through in another place where it's sort of safe, right? Where we can say, hey, what does this tell us about humans as a whole, about society, about government, about how we get along with each other as a whole, where we're not as emotionally tied up in it, right? Because this isn't our world. It's just a story, but we can learn a lot from it. And so it gives us this opportunity to ask some questions about ourselves that aren't as threatening. Whereas, as I'm sure you're aware from the current political climate, if someone not from your political tribe asks these kinds of questions in a way that's not comfortable for you, you can get very defensive. And so movies can be a great place to be able to have some of those tough questions. And when they're well built, they're questions that are open to everyone. I think Blade Runner does a great job of that, and I'm always happy to keep talking about it and other great movies like that with you.
Yeah, this is just a great movie as a sandbox to see how a lot of different ideas can be played out.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the true brilliance of Blade Runner as a sci-fi, and something that is, I think, the gold standard of sci-fi, is it doesn't just get us asking, oh, what happens when like this technology comes around? That's interesting, right? That is an interesting question. But when we see humans whose nature is, somewhat constant, acting in a world where the technological and sort of societal and resource forces are incredibly differently, and we ask, why are they acting this way? This is different from the way that we act today. What is it about our nature that is reflected in that behavior that is true today that we should really pay attention to? That's when you've hit the gold standard, and Blade Runner does that just through and through.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we dig in, I heard through the grapevine one of the greatest podcasting stories that actually has to do with your podcast, that your partner Xander was standing in line to get a book signed and actually overheard something. We have to share this story.
Okay, yeah, this is a great story. Xander shared it with me, and sort of as soon as he was done, he couldn't help but get me on the phone. And of course, he's in the West Coast, and it was an evening thing. So for me on the East Coast, it was really late. I was like, oh my God, what does he want? And he tells me that he's standing in line to get a book signed by Mike Duncan. So Mike Duncan is the History of Rome podcaster and the Revolutions podcaster. And obviously we're huge fans, and he's a big inspiration to us. And we, of course, both got his book, The Storm Before the Storm, which is about the decline and fall of the Roman Republic. Actually, the events immediately before the decline and fall of the Roman Republic. Also something I really like, because just like with fiction, history is a great place for us to start asking some of these questions about ourselves. And so he's in line. And of course, everyone in line, it's a big line. Mike Duncan's a big deal if you've not heard of him. And of course, everyone else in line is like a big history and podcast nerd as well. And so they're talking about, of course, the United States and the late Roman Republic, because what else is on your mind when you're just hanging around thinking about the decline and fall of the Roman Republic. And one guy says, they start talking about voting, right? They start saying like, oh, what are alternative ways for us to vote? What are ways to create a more stable, functional, representative Congress? And one guy goes, I was listening to this podcast recently, and they actually talked about this. They had a whole bunch of different ways to vote. They explained it theoretically and then explained it with a bunch of other countries. And I really liked their Ireland example. And Xander's ears perk up. He's like, we talked about Ireland recently. And this guy goes on to explain pretty well, apparently, how Ireland's election system worked. And it's one that I'm a fan of. And people go like, oh, that's really interesting. I want to listen to it. What's this podcast called? And he goes, oh, it's called Reconsider. And I really like it because what's their motto? It's something like we don't think for you, or we let you think for yourself. And Xander puts on his radio voice and he goes, we don't do the thinking for you. And this guy's like, oh yeah, you listen to it too. So the effect was like slightly lost. He goes, well, I do, but I also make it. I'm Xander, one of the co-hosts. And like everyone's heads explode a little bit. And so all of a sudden Xander has this crowd around him because, of course, it was just this magical moment where someone is gushing about how much they love a podcast, and there's the co-host right there. So they had a great time together, and of course, he just gave out a bunch of business cards and hopefully got a bunch of new fans. And then he got to see Mike Duncan, which was actually the highlight of the night because Mike is so cool. That was a real treat for me to hear because, of course, as you know, as a fellow podcaster, we put so much work into this and it doesn't pay a freaking dime. And so, what do you really get out of it? Sometimes we like hearing ourselves talk, but just to get some independent validation from someone who doesn't know that you're there, that you're doing a good job, that, you've helped people learn some stuff and they really care about what you're talking about. That just, it brightens your day.
That's just the best story, the best podcasting story ever. Now, let's dig into these movies and wrap them up. We have Blade Runner from 1982, Blade Runner 2049, which came out in 2017. Then released shortly before the Blade Runner 2049, 3 shorts were released that were meant to bridge the 1982 Blade Runner movie, which is set in 2019, to bridge to the Blade Runner 2049. And we're going to kind of base the episode around those shorts and then expand on them a little bit. Maybe we can just talk really briefly about what were some of the plot points that crossed over between Blade Runner and Blade Runner 2049, some of those themes that carried over across the two films.
Yeah, definitely. The way I like to think of the way I like to name the 3 shorts in order to keep them right in my head is with their dates, not date of release, obviously, but the dates that they're involved. So there's the first one is Blade Runner, also known as Blade Runner 2019, which is when it was set. And then the 3 shorts are set in 2022, 2036, 2048. And then we have Blade Runner 2049, the full length feature film. And Villanueva, the director, obviously he actually in the shorts, if you go to YouTube and look at the shorts, it's less than half an hour for all 3 of them. They give you a lot of context. And he actually introduces all 3 of them. And he kind of tells you like, look, here's why I decided to make these shorts. Besides the obvious reason of like, hey, it's some hype for the movie and it's good marketing and stuff like that. But for him, obviously, he's kind of a true artist of a director. And for him, they give a lot of context for 2049 in a way that if they had just been at the beginning of 2049 would have felt a little bit disjointed. And so they cover some very, very important plot points very quickly in a way that audiences are able to expect. And so, and therefore, makes 2049 more clear because he obviously had a lot of freedom. He had to sit there and think, where am I going to set 2049? What's happened in the meantime? Because we've now launched ourselves pretty far plot-wise from Philip K. Dick's original novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And so, the 3 big plot things that happen that are the bases of the movie is in 2022, the Nexus 6 replicants cause the blackout. in which, basically all electronic records are lost, at least in LA, maybe in all of North America. And it actually leads us to the question, is there only LA, or is LA kind of an island, right? Is it not connected to other surviving bastions of humanity? That's my favorite question there. In 2036, we see Wallace introduce illegally the Nexus 8 in order to try to win approval from the government of LA, which is another, like, are they the only ones there? Does it matter what other governments think? So he introduces the Nexus 8 to them to win their approval to produce them. And then in 2048, we see Sapper, who's John Batista's big character. If you've seen 2049, he's the first replicant that Kay takes down, the bug farmer. We see him and his sort of daily life struggle and the moment that he decides he needs to flee and hide from LA.
The first mini episode, Blade Runner 2022, was an anime. It wasn't a live action film. What did you think of that one? So
I'll just get this out of the way right now. It was my least favorite. And it was also the longest, and I didn't think it had to be as long. By doing an anime, what Villeneuve actually did was is it Murakawa? Yeah, he basically worked with Murakawa and gave Murakawa a whole lot of creative authority on how to make it. And so, like a lot of Murakawa anime, it's a little. I found it a little heavy-handed, but there's some stuff in there that's a lot of time spent in developing the scene, which is something that happens in 2049 and the original Blade Runner. And so, it's in a way kind of forgivable, but compared to the other two movies, which are just like, they're all just content, let's do it. This one stretches out a little bit. And so, it was not my favorite. I think I understand why anime. It gave them to some extent, it just made it cheaper to do all the scenes they had. They had like an EMP nuke going off. They had off-world fighting. So they had all sorts of things that would have just cost a whole lot of money to develop. Whereas the other two movies, they're very contained. They're essentially one scene, one set, cheaper to make. Anyway, so yeah, it probably told the most important story as far as setting up 2049 as to the the blackout. But to some extent, I think that if you've already seen 2049 and the blackout happened, it may not be all that important for you, in part because you already know the blackout happened. Now, if you'd seen it as like the first short that came out before 2049, you're like, ooh, what's coming? And they say, oh, there's a blackout. Everything's different now. You're like, whoa, crazy, right?
Yeah, I felt that one was just a little bit too much narrative. It didn't really bring into any of the deeper questions, except for that anti-replicant feeling that was on the streets. That was something that I didn't quite pick up in the 2049, but knowing that was something that was maybe in the writer's back of their mind, it starts to make a lot more sense.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that might have been the most powerful part of the film. In 2049, the only anti-replicant feeling we get is, we see people kind of sneer at Kay, and there's some graffiti about skin jobs as he walks up to his apartment. But otherwise, people leave him alone. And that implies that in 2049, people have sort of settled in with the fact that replicants are everywhere and doing a lot of stuff. They may not be happy about it, much in the same way that, insular people people that like moved to Alaska may not be, a long time ago, aren't necessarily happy that there's a lot of mining interests up there, right? And that a lot of people with money are moving up there, but they're not running around killing them. And so there's some implied acceptance. In 2022, the beginning of this, there's absolutely none of that. The Nexus 6 models are I was going to say they're replicated, but they're becoming more ubiquitous, and people are killing them. And we have to ask ourselves why. Nobody says, here's the reason I'm killing this group. And anytime we see humans butchering other humans, they're not really articulate about the deeper reason why that they're so insecure. But one of the things that's pretty clear is that there's fear. That there's a lot of fear that this group of people is going to do something bad. Often, if we think of immigrants, it's often about jobs and crime. And obviously it's hard to not have 1920s and 30s Europe and especially Germany come to mind. But what is sort of implied, if you've sort of seen enough of Blade Runner and you've read Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, one of the things about the replicants is that they're better than humans at just about everything. And what's that mean for humans? Well, it means you're not really necessary anymore, right? So, all these humans, they want to get off world, they want to go to the colonies, and of course, replicants get priority because they're so useful and it's so expensive to send people off world that you're only going to send your best. And also, it seems that there's just a lot of jobs that require special talent that, hey, you can just genetically create that talent. You don't need to run around and recruit from the humans. And so humans see widespread use of replicants as a threat, not just to their well-being in the short or medium term, because it seems that humans are kind of taken care of. Maybe they're given crappy apartment housing and basic income of some sort just to hang on, because there's clearly a lot of unemployment. But as an existential threat of what is it going to mean for us when we're no longer needed, when we're no longer valuable, and replicants are just doing everything because they're better than we are at it. And that is frightening.
That's what it really gets into, is that where does humanity stand in technology? Technology in almost every way makes life better for us. But then when you have these androids who are, like you said, better than humans in almost every way, where do humans stand in all of this? And it's not making their lives better. What does, I guess you can see where humans are feeling like they're getting left out of the equation.
Right. And to some extent, and we see this, if one of the great things about seeing sci-fi is that when it's good, you can tell that the directors or the writers are students of history. Because when people are really afraid, they're going to be left behind. When people are, and it's not just them, it's their progeny, it's their their identified group, right? So whether it's, a racial or ethnic group or religious group or a national group, or in this case, just being human, right? Which changes the whole thing. And as we talked about before, gives us some space to explore that question without it being a hot button issue, right? We're not talking about white people or Catholic people or anything like that. We're just talking about humans. And in history, we've seen that when people feel like they don't have an avenue, another way to advocate for themselves, they turn on the people that they are afraid of. They just take matters in their own hands and they go kind of crazy. I mean, it's terrifying what people are capable of doing.
Another theme that this short brings up is it's kind of the flip side of that. You have these androids they know who they are, so they are self-aware. But we see that in a flashback scene, one of the replicants, he's on one of the off-world colonies and he's fighting and he kills someone. He looks and he sees that they're also an android. That asks the question, is it moral to have soldiers that are both androids fighting each other? Like, what does war become? What does humanity become when we're just throwing these tin soldiers at each other?
Right. And it is a big question. And I think from a plot perspective, my criticism of it is that, well, these guys are really expensive. So, it seemed to imply, the movie to me seems to imply that, they're being thrown at each other because they're not human and we don't care about them as much and that's not a big deal. But if you think of just kind of the cold calculating logic, they're very expensive. And also humans in power have had no problem just throwing masses of other humans at war into a meat grinder before. I think the dehumanization aspect is something that I think is not as well supported. I tend to think of it as, why are they here? Well, one side really needs to win. The other side really needs to win. And so they're going to throw the specially designed super soldiers at it. But what does it show us about the replicants? Well, part of it is that as much as the humans are afraid of the replicants taking their place and humans sort of want this place, the replicants don't have it good either. They are slaves. right? And so we actually have these two groups that are separated. One hates the other and is trying to kill it, but the other one isn't. It's not like things are going well. They're slaves that are designed to, for example, just fight in war, and that's their only purpose, and that's all they are. And so it is dehumanizing, not because they're worthless, but because not because we care about them any less as humans than we tend to care about other humans in times of war, but because they are designed and built as slaves, they're trapped into this, right? And so they have no choice. And so I think if you were kind of an old school, like Straussian conservative or something, one of the takeaways you could have is that when humans are no longer responsible for fighting their own wars, there's a decline in sort of civic duty and civic sentiment. There's less of an attachment to the polity. There's less of an attachment to the society as a whole, because what you can do is you can just grow things and throw them to defend you. So you're no longer tied up in it. You're no longer, in our democracies, for example, when we're not throwing our own sons and daughters at a war, we're no longer as attached to whether we should be having that war in the first place or not. It becomes much more of war becomes a more casual thing, which, for obvious reasons is something that we should be afraid of. So the other thing that's really interesting is the fact that the Nexus were fighting the Nexus, the androids were sent to fight each other in this war, suggests that there's actually that the whole colonization effort is an effort dominated by competing, probably corporate interests that have a profit motive in this, or it's these like different shattered polities across the world, like LA versus, I don't know, Greater Shanghai or New York or something like that. That humanity is far from united, and that our dream of kind of expanding to the stars, whenever almost every sci-fi that talks about expanding to the stars shows this sort of finally united Earth, right? That there's like a United Nations kind of thing, and now Earth is a polity, and these other things are polities. And it's very rare that we have a very, very divided Earth going out. And so the scene is particularly a bummer for me, because it means that, this off-world colony looks like it was valuable enough that, people are willing to fight over it, and Earth is so divided that they are blowing it up, and they're expending resources and creating sentient slaves to go fight over it and butcher each other so that one of them could dominate. And it becomes a whether it's polities or corporations kind of doesn't matter. It becomes a kind of corporatized, just horrible competitive landscape, and has ruined the dream of interstellar expansion it's ruined the hope and the uplifting part of interstellar expansion.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Yeah, definitely. I think especially when you look at earlier sci-fi like Star Trek, where like you said, space is a peaceful kumbaya, and now we're starting to see more sci-fi come out that space is just as broken and militarized as Earth is for us today. I guess that's another thing that's speaking to what our ideals are and what we believe the future is going to look like.
Yeah, exactly. And so if you watch 2022, it's supposed to be a super bummer. It's supposed to make you feel like, oh man, even off world, it's still crappy. There's still war. There's still corporate interests just fighting each other for profit. There's still, thank goodness today we don't have corporate interest. This is sort of this horrible cyberpunk future where corporate interests can just like build slave soldiers and have them fight each other for it. And in a way, it's now that we've gone to the stars, it's not a new frontier that unites us. Instead, it's it's just a new competitive landscape over which nations and corporations will fight. It's a little bit like colonization of the New World or of Africa, that people their feeling at the beginning in this part of history was very hopeful and very exciting that we're gonna expand civilization. We're going to bring it, in their minds, like Christianity and like the light of God to all these people and create this kind of utopia. And it was just ugly and horrible for hundreds of years. And guess what? That repeats. Sorry, your new world is not your salvation. It is in fact just another damning example of human nature.
Yeah, and that whole thing of the blurring of the lines between what government is and what corporations are. The Tyrell Corporation and the government, nobody knows where that stops and where the next one begins. Just quickly to wrap up the Blade Runner 2022, an EMP blast, which is a nuclear weapon of some sort, but it's exploded high in the atmosphere, so it's not the actual radiation and fallout. It's an electromagnetic signal but our electronics are very sensitive to getting blasted by high levels of electromagnetic radiation, and that wipes out all the computer systems. The plot is that the androids are the ones who did this EMP blast, which gets people really mad at the androids, which makes them, well, what happens to the androids after that?
Obviously we talked about this enslavement and the flashback to the off-world war was our main character, whose name I forget, and he's remembering that, and obviously that's a motivator for him, right? That he and other Nexuses, he realizes that they're just being used as tin soldiers to fight these wars, that they are slaves, and that the magnitude of inhumanity is unacceptable, of what humans are willing to do to the androids. And so they concoct an elaborate conspiracy and plot to launch this electromagnetic pulse to essentially short circuit all the electronics, burn them out, and over LA. And again, this is and let's talk about the other cities in a second here. But in order to wipe the records of their creation, because what we see at the beginning of the movie is that people will the replicant records are public. And so what happens is people actually pull up the records to make sure that, the replicant that they're stalking is real. And then they go beat the crap out of them or kill them or rape them or terrible things. And so they know that the only way they can be free, the replicants, is by wiping the records. And they do that, and then they all go into hiding. And so that's actually, and that is a tie-in to 2049, where Kay is trying to hunt down old replicants that have been lost. And so he has to go, to this basement archive with the weird guy, get the sphere, and, and Love brings up the sphere and looks stuff up. So that's what it does, is it creates this rogue and unknown, unrecorded group of replicants that have gone underground into hiding. And of course, they come back in 2049. The only other thing I want to touch on is that it's unanswered in any of the movies whether there is anything besides Los Angeles. But what we do know is that it must be the case that either there is not Los Angeles or there's not a whole lot of connection between Los Angeles and any other bastion of humanity, right? Is it sort of a Judge Dredd megalopolis thing where you're just hey, sorry, you just got a bunch of irradiated wasteland between, you don't have cables between, you're not sharing information, there aren't remote backups. It was, whether or not there are other bastions of humanity, to some extent, LA must be an island, and it must be a very, very lonely place despite being so overpopulated. Because when the EMP goes off over LA, everything is lost. There are no, there are no backups anywhere else. You can't just call Houston and ask for the backup drive to restore everything. So that tells us a lot about that world, that LA is a very lonely place.
The 2022, also that ending sets us up for the next short, 2036 Nexus Dawn, which is just it's one setting inside of an office where there's a panel of who you presumably are the leaders of Los Angeles or whatever this polity is, and they meet with Wallace, who is played by Jared Leto, and he has a meeting with these, I guess we can call them council members or something. They're somehow the government of Los Angeles. What happens in this short episode?
This is by far my favorite, and it's also the shortest. And Jared Leto does, we get, again, if you saw it before 2049, you're like, ooh, Jared Leto's there, and he's late because he has some condition, and he's clearly quite infirmed, and he's kind of crazy, but also super smart. He's Tyrell on steroids, and he comes in with some dude. And he sits down and clearly he wants to talk about restarting the Nexus program. And the city council says, this is not a negotiation. And he says, and yet here we are negotiating. And so we learn from this, and this is where Blade Runner shines. Just from those sort of like those two sentences, we learn that the androids have been made illegal. You cannot produce them anymore. Because obviously after the blackout, they said, you know what, this is just too dangerous. This is a Pandora's box. We have opened it. They're loose, but my God, let's not build another one. And so we've shut down the Nexus program. They're clearly uncontrollable. They're clearly too dangerous. We have no way of integrating them into society in a safe way. Not that they care about the androids at all, although we'll see that there's some humanity in these people. But Wallace wants to boot the program back up, and he's very, very motivated to do it, not out of profit. What's very interesting about Wallace is that he's already loaded. And something we learn later in 2049 is that Wallace is kind of a mad genius. He's developed a lot of technology that saved LA and by extension the world over the past 14 years. After the blackout, he was largely responsible for getting things up and running, for creating new technology to feed humans, and he's made a lot of money on that. I mean, and by a lot, I mean cyberpunk levels of money, where it's like there's so many zeros that you need to start using exponents. And so he's not just looking to make profit; he's looking to take his empire and do something really important. And for him, he makes it very clear that, and there's exposition here, which I don't always love, but Leader does such a good job of it that I like it. That for him, Earth is dead. Like Earth is the past, and you've got a lot of people on Earth. He really doesn't care about the individuals all that much. He does care about humanity and the capacity for humanity to continue and move on. And he makes the case to the council members that they need to dramatically accelerate colonization of off-worlds and exploit the resources there, because we have already destroyed Earth. It cannot sustain humankind much longer. So he implies that despite all his work over the past 14 plus years, Earth is still dying, and that if the off-world colonies cannot be used as resource mines essentially for mankind, Earth will fall. And it's entirely possible that he thinks Earth is going to fall eventually. Earth will fall behind, Earth will sort of disappear off the map or become a backwater, and that the off-world colonies are humanity's future. But it needs a stable footing. It needs a clear beachhead. And so he says, look, the only way to do this is to develop a new line of replicants that we can produce quickly, that can go settle the off-world colonies, make them viable, make them work. And it also implies, as we've talked about, that humanity is just not up to the task, right? That you already have so many people here. Why not just throw them at the problem? It's clear that normal people are not capable of doing this. And it kind of shows just how far mankind has fallen, that even when you don't have an alternative, when you don't have the replicants, you're still not prioritizing humans to go do this because they're kind of garbage.
Don't you also feel that it was implied that he knew that there was a replicant who had somehow miraculously conceived?
Ooh, I actually missed that. Tell me about that.
I kind of felt like when he was giving his speech that he knew that he couldn't make these replicants fast enough. I can't remember the exact quote, but I kind of get the feeling that he was implying that we need these new replicants so that I can find a way to even make them more quickly.
Yes, definitely. And you're right. He does do that. And therefore he teases to us something that is a mystery when we first watch it, but is, of course, revealed in 2049 that, yes, he's become aware of this, Christ-like miracle birth, which is in many movies is a bit of a tired trope, but, as usual, 2049 handles it pretty well. And what he implies is that we can't just make new replicants. We have to make replicants that can replicate themselves so that they can, inhabit these colonies and very quickly grow. And by quickly, we mean over maybe a few generations, or maybe they just grow so quickly that their generations are shorter than ours. But you can't just make replicants. You also have to have them replicating themselves in order to colonize these worlds fast enough in order for humanity to hold on. This sense of urgency in him is so deep. And he seems to be, at first he seems to be the only person that really feels this. But when he makes this case, sort of the eyes of the council that's there, you see their expressions sink a little bit, and they know that Earth is in a lot of trouble and maybe doomed. And so, and that when he gets them to wordlessly admit that, their ears are now open. They're ready for him to make his case.
That town council too, I thought that was so cool because they are more directly connected to the people, I think, in a way where almost our government now, they're in Washington. They don't know always what's happening to the people on the ground, but these still are sort of just city councilmen, city government, and they're horrified by what Wallace is saying, but also they kind of know pragmatically that they have to do what he's saying.
Right. Yeah, they really are, in a way, like true public servants. At least we see them acting as these like true public servants that feel like they're in a time of crisis that they have to rise to the occasion to deal with. They're actually very sympathetic characters. And they're sympathetic not just because they see the big picture and they care about LA or Earth or whatever, but also when Wallace introduces his new Nexus model, the 8, the first thing Wallace does is he orders the replicant to like find a weapon and cut itself. And you see all of I think there are 3 council members. They're like, oh God, they're horrified by it, which implies that their kind of instinctual humanity is still there. They know that this Nexus is not human. And we've seen in the previous movie that, the inhumanity that people are willing to subject androids to because they don't see them as human, or maybe it doesn't matter because, again, historically we've done that to people left and right. But these people still have this humanity inside them that they're so appalled, and they keep telling them to stop making the thing hurt itself. That instinct is still there, and that's something that makes you really decide to like them. That they're not just sitting there being like, "Oh yes, bravo, like well done, yes, it will follow your orders and cut itself." They're like, "Oh God, Wallace, monster."
Yeah, it really does get to that humanity. Like where we are right now, robots on a factory line are still just robots, but there is an AI that's coming at some point where the line's really going to get blurred between what's human and what's machine. And they're exploring what happens when you get past that line.
Yes, absolutely. And I just realized we need to make a serious correction about our numbering here. So the nexuses that we were dealing with in 2022 were not the 6s. They were the 8s. The 6s were from Blade Runner 2019. This is all my fault. The 6s were from Blade Runner 2019. The 8s were the ones that were given a full lifespan, not just a few years. And they're the ones who rebel. And that's the end of the Nexus line, the end of Tyrell Corp. But Wallace comes back with a Nexus 9.
So the 8s only exist in this mini episode period.
Right. Yeah. So we in 2022, the replicants we're dealing with are 8s. In 2049, there's a lot of 8s as well. Bautista's an 8 that Kay is hunting down. And, obviously the rebellion is almost certainly just all Nexus 8s that went off grid after the blackout. And that's where they come from. If you wonder, like, where do all these 8s come from? They were running around and the program was shut down. They're trying to hunt them down, but there's still a lot left. To your question about that line. Yeah. I mean, the thing that shows that we have crossed the line over to a piece of technology that has what we would think of as kind of personhood properties, probably from like the Peter Singer perspective. He's a modern philosopher. I think he's at Princeton. His line is like whether something is capable of suffering. This thing is clearly capable of suffering because Leto has him cut himself, has the Nexus 9, the replicant, cut himself to show that he will follow any order. And also he has to, in order to demonstrate the depth of the Nexus 9's obedience, he has to demonstrate that the Nexus 9 isn't just cutting itself, right? Like we can get a welding robot to like put a weld spot on itself, but who cares? That doesn't really show us much. What he's able to show with the Nexus 9 is that it felt pain when it cut itself, and it was still okay with that. The pain is important when you have a very autonomous thing, right? That's why evolution developed it, because it needs to know like, oh, this is damaging me. Maybe I shouldn't do this. So of course the Nexuses have kept pain, and we even knew that the Nexus 6 models had pain, right? We see Roy Batty feeling some pain, but his pain seemed to have been dampened. So this guy, Leto confirms that he can feel pain, which is a necessary thing for it to be able to operate independently, so it doesn't just get itself killed, but that it's going to obey him anyway. And of course, that's the part where, as shocking to no one, that's the part we start to feel some humanity for it, and we really start to feel bad. Because if it was like, no, I don't feel pain, like you just wouldn't feel as bad, right? You wouldn't worry as much about the thing because it's like, oh, okay, it doesn't suffer, but we know it suffers, and the really horrifying thing about Wallace is that he's built something that suffers and is so obedient that it will make itself suffer on demand.
He really has to make it that way because that's the only way that the town council will acquiesce to making these robots.
Exactly, because the 8s were so destructive to LA, because they essentially had a form of free will. They were not fully obedient. And so the only way that he could possibly convince the town council was by having a very graphic demonstration of the depths of complete loyalty and obedience that these things have. They will never rebel. They will never disobey an order. They will never, do anything that threatens humanity. They're just going to be perfect slaves. And so not only does he get this Nexus 9 to cut itself, but he then gets the Nexus 9. He forces the Nexus 9 to choose. It says, you have a choice. You could either kill me or you can kill yourself. It wasn't just follow an order, kill yourself. What was he demonstrating in this? He was demonstrating that they have the capacity for choice, right? They're able to make decisions. And because they are so loyal, it's not just that they will follow a direct order to kill themselves, but they are so loyal. They're so deeply brainwashed that they would just, without hesitation, when their choice is to kill themselves or kill their master, they will just kill themselves and be totally content with it. And the council freaks out even more at that, not just because there's a lot of blood, not just because Wallace had something that suffers kill itself, but because he created something that is instantly repulsive to us, that is a monster. Not because it is scary to us, right? Not because they are afraid of it, but because it is so inhuman and so horrifying for us to imagine, like, hey, you have a choice to kill me or kill yourself, and it chooses to kill itself. That he's created something like abhorrent, and again necessary, because of course we don't see them acquiesce, but obviously Blade Runner 2049 happens. They do acquiesce, and over those 13 years, Wallace creates a whole lot of these things.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. So last mini episode, it was a lot of fun. It was just a brief, I think it was maybe about 5 or 6 minutes, and it showed how the character played by the wrestler Batista, a little bit of his background. I thought this was a fun one, but it also maybe seemed like it was a scene that they had in the movie and that got maybe cut out for time.
That's very likely possible. One thing we know about Villanueva is he's very good at killing darlings. And he talks about this in interviews. So there are he even talks about a number of scenes that went missing that hit the cutting room floor in 2049 that, his writer has advocated for. He's like, nope, kill it. And And this may have been one of them, but it was, because it didn't mesh with the movie perfectly. It wasn't the perfect, it didn't make it a truly complete piece of art, but it also gives us insight into who Sapper is. And again, as a marketing tool, we have to contextualize all of this stuff as the reason it's being released is it is in the run up to 2049. Why is it here? And to some extent, it's to introduce a character that we're going to like, that we know is going to be in the movie, that, is a very, he is a Nexus, and he's a Nexus 8, and he's a very sympathetic character. Almost to the point of like Villanueva flirts with being a little bit sentimental about it because he's such a good guy. But it just shows the humanity that the Nexus 8 models had and have. And I think demonstrating, after 2022, in 2022, they're kind of, they're a little bit deadpan. You don't really like them, even though you're on their team in this, because they are being enslaved. But in this, you see a Batista that at the very beginning, he's freaking out. His heart rate is elevated. He's sweating. He's having an emotionally very hard time. He's afraid. And then throughout the movie, what we end up seeing him do is just save someone he knows, like a little girl and her mother that, he probably knows somewhat casually because he's kind of a member of the community and all sorts of good stuff that makes you like him. And then some thugs try to rape the mom, and he beats the crap out of them and ends up killing all of them and then runs away. And that's the plot of that story. And so to some extent, you're kind of like, well, what's the point? And I think the point is to demonstrate that these 8s, the Nexus 8s, were designed, and they were designed by Tyrell, who saw them as children, whereas Wallace sees his Nexus models as angels. And I think that's a very important difference. But so you see that these 8s, who are a very important part of 2049, and if there's a sequel to 2049, will continue to be a very important part. You see that they are the most like humans of any of the models, and that Batista, if it weren't for his genetic marker, would be completely indistinguishable from humans. And that's the scene we see. Whereas at the beginning of 2049, there's this awesome contrast to Kay, who's like really, and Ryan Gosling does such a good job of this because it's kind of what Ryan Gosling does. But like Kay doesn't give a shit, right? At the beginning. And so the difference we see between Sapper and Kay really shows us how Tyrell and Wallace thought of this differently, and that there has been a substantial departure between the 8s and the 9s.
Yeah, Kay has no affect, not from the beginning of the movie to the end of the movie. Even when he does become more self-aware and more invested in what his android life is, he never is a warm and gushy guy, where obviously the Bautista Sapper character, he loves, he hates, he has all the human emotions.
Yeah. And Tyrell says that, of course, he says that the reason he does this is to have his models work together with humans better. But really, I think that the thing that ultimately kills Tyrell in the 2019 movie is that he loves his children. And he sees himself as a God that is creating children. He loves them, and he wants them to prosper. And he wants them to be part of humanity in a way. And he, of course, designed the limitations, but, you see him with Roy Batty, and he lets Roy come close and he talks to him. He tries to console him. He tries to make Roy feel better and is proud of him. He's proud of his son. And the Tyrell, obviously Tyrell didn't create the 8s personally, because he was dead, but that Tyrell tradition of creating children who are like humans was his approach. And Sapper has that, for him, we find him indistinguishable emotionally for us, instinctually for us. He's indistinguishable from a human. And Wallace, who calls his replicants angels, that they are above it all, right? Angels don't have love, or, maybe they have love in the sense of like the love of God for humanity as a whole, but they don't like and dislike. They don't care. They're not really deeply involved in the affairs of a single human. They're not going to get attached to them. Their duty is to serve their God, right? To execute the orders of heaven. And that makes them much less sympathetic. And I really like the difference that Villanueva is able to demonstrate there.
One thing that all of these shorts and basically both of the movies made me think of, and a question that I've been really interested in asking you, is it made me think of the whole idea that Karl Marx came up with, that humanity is going to hit a point where technology and economics are going to get us to a point where people really aren't going to have to toil and struggle the way they did. Now, you can correct any of what I'm saying. I'm certainly no expert in Marxist economics and in philosophy. It seems like the pieces are in place in this movie, but it's more of a dystopia. It's not a utopia in any stretch of the imagination. What did you think about that? Is that something you thought of?
Yes, I do. Or I did. Excuse me. Yes, I did. And I think what the whole Blade Runner series does, we have these 5 pieces of art. One of the things it does about humanity is it kind of makes you hate humanity a little bit, right? They're kind of like rats. In particular, in the first movie, they're much like rats, but also in 2049, the humans, they just don't matter all that much. I mean, there's a few very exceptional ones who do beautiful things. But most of humanity just seems to be like running around. They're, in particular in 2019, they're idling away in the most grotesque of pleasures. They spend their time drinking. They're in this club that we have. I forget her name, but the replicant who's posing as a dancer, she does unspeakable things with a snake. And you're like, oh God, it's gross. And so you have all these humans that are idling away their time by just finding more and more visceral kind of pleasures of the flesh to entertain themselves, and they don't have real connections with other humans, even though they're packed in with other humans. You feel very alienated. Nobody looks at each other. Nobody really has a real conversation about being human in the entire movie. All the conversations are transactional. People, what do they want? They want like noodles, and they want some like fake animals, and they want to see people do obscene stuff with fake animals. And it's humanity has become disgusting. And why is that? I do think that Blade Runner is offering an illustrative counterpoint to Marx's position, right? And this is something that I think, if it's compelling for you, is something that we need to think about in either our lifetimes or our children's lifetimes, is this. When people have no purpose, when they have nothing to do, when they have nothing to contribute, they don't become artists. They become, I don't want to say monsters, but they become just kind of like disgusting and boring. And, the idea of Marx and some of the utopian ideal of something like, say, a universal basic income is that, when people have freedom and time, they're going to do amazing things, right? When they don't have to worry about income, when they don't need to work, when there's nothing demanded of them, they're going to choose to study and choose to create art and choose to pursue these higher things. And, and in Blade Runner, they don't. And I think that one of the things we could think about today is that a lot of people have, and not everyone, but a lot of people have a lot more leisure time than they've ever had, right? Like vacation in the United States for like the upper middle class, you think of like the engineer class, or you think of a lot of those, it's higher than it ever was. They don't actually work long hours. We're not talking about 14, 16-hour days. Again, for a lot of people, you've got, someone could be like, but what about the single mom that's working 2 jobs? Yeah, that is real, and that's part of us. But you have some humans starting to come up to this point, not that they don't need to work at all, but that they don't need to work a whole lot. And so they have a lot of time and they have a lot of money. And what do we do with it? Well, we play video games and we hang out on Facebook and Snapchat, and we take we'll go on vacation. Why? So that we can take videos of ourselves and share with our friends and get them to hit like on it. How many people are really, spending their time becoming scholars, becoming great artists, And that number may be, again, if you find this kind of counter thesis compelling, that number may be depressingly low. And what's that going to become? Because do I happen to believe that AI taking over almost all human production is inevitable? Totally. Right? Like absolutely. Because it's going to just become much more skilled and much cheaper. So we just won't be able to compete. And we'll have to, after some difficult political transition, we'll have to have some sort of basic income. We'll have to have some sort of way that people can enjoy the fruits of production without participating in it. And Marx and a lot of people believe this will lead to utopia. And there's a compelling case that I think cannot be ignored, that this will not lead to utopia, that that human nature needs a purpose. It needs demands and duties and some sort of, something to struggle for, or else we'll just idle away in simple pleasures.
For me, science fiction is always at its best when it's a medium for observing and discussing current culture and events. Do you think Blade Runner, the 1982 version, and this 2049, will they continue to be relevant? Did they hit themes that we're going to be facing for a while as a species, as a people?
I like the way you asked that question because you use like the future imperfect that we're going to be facing. Not just that we're facing now. We are facing some of this now, right? We're facing, idleness and greater temptation, technological temptations to our more primitive parts of our minds. We're starting to maybe face displacement of people in work, although of course, unemployment is really low right now. And so are we facing it at the moment? Probably not. But we're sort of staring at the horizon going, ooh, boy, this is coming. And so the reason I love the way you face that is I think Blade Runner has not reached its max relevancy yet. And I think that's what's so cool about it is it's not just visionary in that it's able to compellingly imagine what would happen in this far off future that tells us about ourselves now. But it's able to imagine this far off future to make us think about this near term future, to make us think about, okay, we are reaching a point where there's going to be AI and greater idleness. We are reaching a point where people are going to become, jobless and maybe will be, put up in block housing by the government in order to survive. And so I have to imagine, and it's hard not to be biased because I do love these two movies so much. But I really do imagine that the things we start to think about here are going to be more relevant in 20 years than they are now. And they're going to become more relevant in, it's kind of impossible to even really think about what technology is going to look like after 20 years from now. They tried to do that in the 1950s and be like, yes, in 2001, we will have flying cars and we'll live on the moon. It's like, that didn't happen. But a whole lot of different stuff that you didn't imagine at all did happen. And so if we don't take any of the particular bits of technology too seriously, but instead say, what is happening? Environmental degradation, urban population explosion, and the replacement of humans with AI, that is going to become increasingly human-like. And that's one of the things Joy does really well, is because it's harder for us to imagine a replicant soon, but it's easier for us to imagine something like Joy soon, right? Because just the AI part seems a little more within our grasp than creating, fully functional biological machines. I think that stuff is coming. And so this is something that can get us thinking about stuff that we're going to have to deal with in 20 years. But of course, also it has us thinking about what we're doing today, right? So for example, in these movies, we do terrible things to androids in order to exploit them. Well, if you take a kind of Peter Singer type philosophical perspective, we already do terrible things to animals for food. And we just don't really, I'm not even, I feel guilty when I eat meat. I still eat meat. And I think, do I think veganism is a really ethically compelling position? Absolutely, right? These animals suffer so that we can eat yummy things that we don't even need, right? That we want. We just want I want a hamburger. And so I'm willing to participate in the suffering of animals for it. And even though we have an alternative. And so is that something that's part of human nature? Probably. And what I think is really interesting about meat is that in the future, we'll create our meat out of vats just because it will be cheaper. And like, my God, our grandchildren are probably going to look back at us and say, sweet holy Moses, you like raised animals and caged them and butchered them so that you could eat this stuff. It's just going to be unimaginably horrifying to them. So are we already like that? Absolutely, right? We're not great paragons of humanity. We're not consistent in our own ethics. And is that something that's going to continue about humanity and get challenged again and again as new technology comes up? And in particular, as we start to create AI that becomes increasingly indistinguishable from humans? Yes. That question is going to come up. And, Blade Runner paints a very bleak picture about how we're going to respond to it. But it also is a compelling picture because it's hard to imagine how we would act very, very differently. How is human nature going to change along with this stuff? This is programmed into our minds from millions of years of evolution. It's part of who we are. And so what can we do about it? I don't have a good answer. But I think these are questions worth asking.
You're definitely making a point where the lines of everything are becoming so fuzzy. We don't know where to draw lines completely. Like, our ancestors who had to kill an animal to just eat, it's not as much of a moral question as now you're so separated from where the unethical behavior that we can even think about it as unethical, where that's what it's going to become with this AI. Like right now, it's not, we're so separated from it, but we're really running quickly towards a problem that we're going to have to face. And we're not really thinking about it.
Yes. We are going to have to, the theme, Blade Runner has many subtle themes. The theme that is impossible to miss is that at some point we're going to have to radically redefine personhood. It's not just humans. And we're not even good at treating humans great yet. But let's say we somehow get around to that, because we do seem to be getting better at treating humans well. We're going to have to radically redefine what personhood is and what defines someone who is sufficiently person-like or suffers or whatever ethical framework you want to use in order to have some rights and protection. Blade Runner, both of them, is a warning for the future. And it's very easy that, and what it tells us is that historically, humans are very good at dehumanizing. In particular, when people seem different, right? It's just a fundamental tribal thing that when people are different, we tend to dehumanize them. This also applies to animals who suffer. And we use and kill and we make people suffer in order to either get a rational need, which if you're of the more left-wing variety, people are like, yes, corporations exploiting people. But perhaps the greater injustices that we do to each other are for irrational needs, not for profit, but out of fear, but out of, giving into our tribal need to have something to hate, out of like the need to be part of some group that is different, whether it's your race or your religion or something like that. All these things are part of our human nature. And so even if we pass out of capitalism, this will continue to happen. And this is the framework. This is the mental framework that's part of our lizard brain that's going to be there, that you can't get rid of when we start ushering in new intelligent life into the world. And the fact that humans suffer consequences for this, for this dehumanization in Blade Runner, especially 2022, is almost beside the point, right? So is 2022 a warning that, if you're too bad to these things, they're going to come nip you in the butt? No, that's not the point. This isn't some Old Testament fable where, when you do bad things, the like godlike creatures will cause something very bad to happen to you. This isn't like, I think the blackout is more than a moral warning or a caution to humans that there are consequences. I think the blackout is just a tool to actually create an interesting story. But because things go on and they don't like get better after that, right? And humans don't really suffer all that much either. And so that's not the point of the blackout. The blackout is just a plot tool. And it doesn't degrade from the greater theme that as humans, we have to fight vigilantly and find some way to overcome our own nature. And to find those, what's so interesting is, of course, the point of Blade Runner is to ask, what does it mean to be human? And you start thinking like, ooh, what it means to be human is to be like kind of rotten in a lot of ways, and to be selfish, and to be dehumanizing, and to be part of this, to have all these terrible traits. But there are good parts too, and we see that in these movies. They are rare, but they're beautiful when they emerge. And that's the part of humanity that we want, and that's the part of humanity that we ask about other things when we ask if they're human. We don't ask if they're kind of rotten to each other. We ask like, oh, do they have love and compassion? Do they care about things? And that's the question that's asked in 1982 of the replicants, and it's the question, and it tells us that that's what we value in ourselves most. And this whole series of Blade Runner says, if these are the things we value in ourselves most, how do we, is there some way that we can actually bring them to the forefront of who we are? Is there some way that we can actually make compassion and love something that is the primary, expression of humanity, rather than all the terrible things that, we see done in these movies and we see done throughout history? Because if we don't, we face a very bleak future.
We've talked about the movies Blade Runner for probably going on about 5 hours now, and the audience has listened to this. What do you want to leave us with?
Yeah. Well, first, everyone, I hope you've enjoyed all these 5 hours, because, yeah. Oh, I have too. I mean, we've of course of course you could write dissertations on these movies, and what they mean as far as, in particular ethics. But I think what I want to leave people with is that my advice for people on Blade Runner is watch it all multiple times, especially the first one. Watch the final cut, watch it multiple times with these questions in mind, and you'll start to see some of those things come out. Watch 2049 multiple times with those questions. You'll start to see these things come out. And, we just talked about all these problems that humanity is going to run into, and all these terrible things about humanity. And can you, as if you're feeling this like pain from it, good, because that's what the movies are meant to do. And you might be thinking, what can I do about it? And, right now I don't want this to become a call to action, that you need to act, that you need to like be the one that sets out to change humanity. Because of course, Blade Runner is a warning about that as well, about trying to create a more perfect human species. It is a warning about trying to do that. And so you can feel helpless a lot of the time. If there's something you want to do to take away from this, just take time with yourself and, dare I say, like meditate on these questions and these problems about humanity. Because the one thing you do have control over as a person is how you choose to express your humanity and what example you can set for others. Because, of course, one of the things we do see in Blade Runner is that when people, such as Roy Batty at the end, such as, even Kay, when they do find ways, and of course, it's only the replicants doing this, but when they do find ways to express the more beautiful, more compassionate parts of their humanity, other people catch on. And of course, many wise people have tried to teach us this many times over the millennia. But if you're looking for something to do, it is to consider how you can be an example of the humanity that we want to be.
I want to thank the audience so much for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast. And of course, a big thanks goes out to you, Erik, the host of the Reconsider podcast. Links to find more about Reconsider can be found at reconsidermedia.com/podcast. And it's also a great website there's so many great articles, and you should definitely follow Reconsider on all the social media. And just thanks again so much for coming on, Erik.
Of course, my pleasure. I have so much fun with this stuff. I consider it an indulgence more than work. To the audience, if you enjoy having me and Steve dig up these like really kind of ethically gnarly concepts in movies, let us know on, go to Beyond the Big Screen, go to the Facebook page, go to the comment section. Let us know if you liked it, if you want more. And in particular, if there are movies you want us to pick apart here, because there's a whole lot of depth to other film as well besides besides Blade Runner, that I'd love to talk about, but of course, I don't want to bore you guys with it. This is something that I can do over cocktails on my own time. But if there's stuff that you guys are keen to hear, let us know, because it'll help us, like jump into this with excitement and confidence, rather than worrying that we're going to bore you.
Yeah, I know I can talk about science fiction for days. So I'd be glad to do this anytime.
Yeah. So guys, if you want to hear more, let us know. Tell us, because that'll be the thing that most likely gets us back digging into, sci-fi or other movies that are exploring humanity, exploring ethics in this kind of depth.
If you'd like to learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, see show notes, and connect to social media, go over to a2zhistorypage.com. I'd love to hear your questions, comments, and feedback, especially about this episode series. And if you're liking this longer form series of episodes, I love them, and I probably will do many more of them. But let me know what you think about them, so we can talk movies, and I would definitely like to hear your idea for future episode topics or interesting guests. If you want to send an email, you can send it to steve@a2zhistorypage.com. And if you like what you hear, I would really appreciate you leaving the show a rating and review on iTunes, or now Apple Podcasts. The ratings and reviews really help me a great deal to let me know what you think about the show and how to make the show better. And these Apple Podcast reviews also let other people find out about the show, so we can keep this whole thing going. So we will see you next time beyond the big screen.